Of course, welcome, a warm welcome to all of you who are here for our final lecture. I want to remind everyone to turn their cell phones off. It seems kind of redundant to repeat this each evening, but you know, there's so much a part of our lives that sometimes we forget, so if you would do that, please. You should all have received your evaluation forms, and I know this is not your favorite part of the whole week, but we really do appreciate those forms when we get around to planning next year's event. And some of you have given me interesting comments about things that you liked or suggested, so I want you to write those out legibly. I want to remind you also that we still have some books on the book table, so this is your last opportunity to purchase one and perhaps get Dr. Boers to sign it for you. For me, that's one of the joys of going to conferences and things like this. For me, those are tangible reminders and connections with the people that I've heard, and maybe that'll be the same for you. So if you would just look at those books. I'm going to talk a little bit about them in a minute. So, I guess we're ready to go. So it's my pleasure to do the introductions tonight. Last few years, I've done the Wednesday night introduction, which has its sort of blessings and challenges, because you've heard and read about all of the credentials and the kinds of life history kinds of things that we use in formal introductions. You don't need to hear those again. So I like to do something that is a little bit more personal, but then of course that's sometimes I have to think a little bit more about that. So here we go. I was first introduced to Dr. Arthur Boers in 1992 by a good mutual friend, the late Dr. Brian Dufton. Some of you who live in this area will remember him as a wonderful Christian and a gifted psychologist who worked at the Valley Regional Hospital. He was tragically killed in 2000 in a car accident. Brian was a member of my Bible study group. We called ourselves Koinonia, and he suggested that we use Arthur's book, Lord, Teach Us to Pray, a new look at the Lord's Prayer, as our study book that year. He and Janie, his wife, knew Arthur and Lorna very well from their years in Ontario. That book opened our eyes to the richness and depth of the prayer that Dietrich Bonhoeffer said was the quintessence of prayer, and that Tertullian claimed was the summary of the whole gospel. I have never since then prayed that oft-repeated prayer in the semi-automatic way I might have prayed it before that study. I've read a number of books on the Lord's Prayer, but none surpasses Arthur's. We weren't able to get it we didn't get it for our book table this year, but I'm delighted that it's been reprinted by Whitf and Stock and still available, so I would recommend it to you as a wonderful study book. A few years later, we tackled On Earth as in Heaven, which explored the deep connections between a personal Christian spirituality and social justice. Dr. Boers wrote that we can't experience God in heaven without loving the needy on earth, nor can we truly love the needy on earth if not empowered by God in heaven. Over the years, I came to think of Arthur as a friend, eagerly looking forward to his rich literary offerings, especially in the area of prayer. I also found his books to have immediate practical application in ministry. I strongly, and I'll underline that, I strongly recommend his book, Never Call Them Jerks, Healthy Responses to Difficult Behavior. Despite the minor obstacle of the un-Canadian spelling of behavior, It does represent a blend of solid social science research and biblical insight. I found the book not only helpful in understanding the difficult people in my church and life, but also surprisingly direct in uncovering the difficult behavior in me. Not just theory, this book gives strategies for helpful and restorative approaches to the people to and with whom we minister. I'm relieved that I still have some reading pleasures ahead of me, and I'm looking forward to his most recent book on which these lectures are based. In the last 2 evenings, Arthur has defined and described some of the challenges of living in our commercially and technologically driven culture. This evening, he will explore some strategies for those mindful Christians who choose to live the abundant life that God in Christ offers, and indeed wills for us. It's been a blessing for me to meet Arthur and his wife Lorna in person, and I trust these lectures have been a blessing to you as well. So I would invite Dr. Boers to come up, and I'll offer a prayer of gratitude and blessing for him for leading us this evening. And then I would invite you to join me mindfully and thoughtfully in the Lord's Prayer. So let's pray. Loving and gracious God, we thank you for the blessings that you offer us, especially those that we are often unconscious of or take for granted. The ability to assemble in freedom and peace, to discuss the deep matters of faith, and to openly share those with others. We thank you for this week, for all of the richness that it has offered to us, and we pray especially for Dr. Boers as he leads us this final evening. Anoint him as he brings to us his words of wisdom for us. And now, let we pray as you taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you. Well, good evening. It's a little hard to see you folks because of the bright lights, but I can see you somewhat, and that's important to me when I speak. I want to say again how grateful I am to be here and how much I've enjoyed my time with you these days, and I'll say a few more words about that later on, but it's certainly been a great honor, and I felt supported and encouraged and challenged by our conversations together, and will return home energized and deeply grateful, and I will return to Toronto with the testimony that that Canada's other Baptist seminary beside Tyndale is truly an extraordinary place, and Trisha's given me all kinds of PR literature which she expects me to be handing out in Toronto. That's all I'll say about that. I want to thank Carol Ann for the generous introduction. One thing she didn't tell you is that, in fact, it is true that she and I met for the first time this week. I actually knew her father previously. We were ministers in the same conference. And I want to apologize to Carol Ann for the American spelling in the subtitle of my Never Call Them Jerks books. Canadian authors have very little power, actually, and we experienced that with the latest book. We had a hard time getting the latest book here across the border to be sold. So if we have little say over getting books here, we also have little say over the titles of books. Did you know that authors usually don't have much say over the titles of books? Now, I will take credit for the title, Never Call Them Jerks. That is the title that I wanted on the book, but the publisher didn't want that title. And I had to argue at great length with them about it. And they used to have this series of books called An Alban Guide to This and An Alban Guide to that. And I was deathly afraid that they were going to call it An Alban Guide to Difficult Behavior. And well, you get the idea, right? So I thought, and then a good subtitle would be A Really Boring Book. But yeah, authors don't have final say. Eugene Peterson published a wonderful memoir last year, and he didn't even Eugene Peterson doesn't get the title he wanted. He wanted to call it Every Step in Arrival. If you know Eugene's writing, he likes poetry a lot, and that's a line from a poem, and the publisher called it The Pastor. So I still think Every Step in Arrival would be better. And on this book, the latest book, Living into Focus, I've tried a number of titles, all of which they rejected. They even rejected Lorna's great title. Lorna wanted to call it The Information Highway is Paved with Good Intentions. I thought that was pretty good. They didn't like it. And they said, we're going to call it Living in Focus. And I argued and I argued and I argued with them. And as a Dutchman, I have that prerogative of arguing nonstop. And they finally said, look, this is the title. Shut up already. Actually, there are a lot of Dutch people at that publishing house, too. Maybe that was the problem. And I said, look, if you add 2 letters to the title, I'll shut up. That is, if you change it from Living in Focus to Living into Focus, I would feel a lot better about it. And because I think that's a significant difference. The Living in Focus kind of gives this sense that you can find that perfect spot, that magic place, where you have it sorted out and you've got it exactly right and you're balanced and you don't have to make any adjustments. Now, there may be some Christians who live that way, but I've never found it. Like I said last night, I'm a lot more like Bruce Coburn, who says, I've never lived with balance, though I've always liked the notion. But living into focus feels better to me because there's this sense of continual evaluation and reevaluation and adjustment and discernment that goes on. If you think of the yellow lights metaphor that I used last night, there's no one perfect solution in all circumstances. So you keep just working at it and adjusting it throughout your life. Well, I don't know about you, but I spend far too much time in airports. I expected a recent trip to be straightforwardly simple. I needed to take 3 flights and knew that I would travel for the better part of a day. I brought along ample reading and work to keep meaningfully occupied and to avert fretting while underway. I arrived in plenty of time at the first airport, and I was optimistic about the day ahead. More fool me. Bad weather not only delayed my own flight, but several flights before and after it, and the gate area gradually filled with people, and their rising anxiety was palpable. There were not enough chairs, many sat on the floor or loomed over those who were seated, and knowledge that in 2 days it would be the year's busiest flying day increased the tension in the room. At noon, passengers were already being recruited to stay the night. My flight eventually left 2 hours late and touched down in time for me to miss my connection on another airline in a neighboring terminal. Booked on jets from 2 different companies, I was now in limbo, or perhaps more accurately, purgatory, and neither airline was willing to be responsible for me. I lined up for 30 minutes at the missed airline. They referred me to the first airline to try another flight. So I waited at that airline's gate. They insisted that I needed to leave the secure area and go to a ticket counter in another terminal. After half an hour there, they informed me that I could stay overnight at my own expense or try flying with yet another airline, but I would have to line up elsewhere and speak to that airline. Confused? So was I. These clerks thought that the lines were better in a third terminal, so I proceeded there. I stood at the counter for 45 minutes as attendants argued with the other airline about who should pay for my new ticket. They also tried unsuccessfully to locate my baggage. They finally gave me a ticket 25 minutes before another flight was to leave from a fourth terminal. I ran as fast as I could. No doubt my haste and perspiration made me look suspicious. At security, I was pulled aside for extra scrutiny. When I pointed out how late I was, they said that I could just catch a flight the next day. Thanks a lot. They scrutinized my books and happily concluded that it was okay for me to read mystery novels. Once through, I ran again. I caught my flight, and we then waited on the runway for several hours. By the time we arrived at the next airport, it was midnight, so I missed my final flight home and remained overnight in a pricey hotel nearby at my own expense, of course. The point is not one bad airport day, although those seem to happen more often lately. Although I have to say, this week I figured out the best way to fly is to have Evelyn, Harry's secretary, arrange your life, and things are good. A good idea. My point really is that experience in the airports highlighted how airports all too much resemble the rest of our lives. It seems to me that I spend considerable time running, scurrying, and hasting to no apparent end. I do not spare enough thought or attention to discerning choices or setting priorities or aligning actions with values. I hardly know whom to ask to help me figure things out, and in much of my day-to-day experience, I feel isolated and alone, cut off from people and places and priorities that I value most. Where to turn? At a consultation in 2001, Albert Borgman told us of an important turning point in his life. As a young man, he moved from Germany to the U.S. for undergraduate work, and he really liked the U.S. One of my happiest memories of visiting with Albert Borgman, this brilliant German philosopher, was riding in his car in Montana in the back seat, and he put in his favorite tape of American music, and he sang all the way through the long version of Bye Bye Miss American Pie in his German accent. He didn't just fall in love with American culture, he fell in love with a young German major from Illinois named Nancy. So it was a tough call for him when he decided to return to his native Germany to do doctoral work. And while there, he told a group that I met with, while there he felt grim and bitter. He was discouraged and depressed. He didn't like the German educational system. He wanted to go back to the U.S. He wanted to be close to his beloved Nancy. Right around then, he signed up for a retreat that was led by a renowned theologian by the impressive name of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Von Balthasar guided Borgman in this retreat and tried to uncover and tease out whether or not there were moments of God's grace that Borgman could experience in his life in spite of the discouragement and the setbacks, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. And Borgman discovered from that experience with Hans Urs von Balthasar several discerning statements that he now often repeats and uses with students. This is what he said. I tell them 4 focal affirmations and ask, when were you last able to affirm them? There is no place I would rather be. There is nothing I would rather do. There is no one I would rather be with. This I will remember well. When was the last time you could affirm one of these statements? We know that there are moments in life when everything feels properly ordered, when all seems right with the world or our lives, where nothing more is needed. When I think of those focal affirmations, I think of days and weeks spent at monasteries, or being at a cottage with my family, or long-distance hiking once, as you know, for an 800-kilometer stretch, or Sunday mornings in worship. I want to live so that I can regularly offer those focal affirmations. And I believe it's possible. I believe that we have the agency to make these kind of choices. It is too easy to give up and turn over responsibility to other people, other forces, other institutions, or to blame other influences. We have choices. It is in our power to embrace fulfilling lifestyles. It is in our power to choose cooking meals, offering hospitality, conversing, going for walks, getting exercise, learning arts and crafts. All of these things are within our reach. I agree with Albert Borgman when he says that the good life is within reach for most of us. Parker Palmer has argued that every social movement begins with individuals who decide that they will live divided no more. Divided no more. Divided no more between their deepest values and the ways that they actually live and behave. These individuals, says Palmer, act even if they must do so alone, in solitude. His shining example in his fine book, The Courage to Teach, is Rosa Parks' refusal to go to the back of the bus and to relinquish her seat to a white man. And Palmer points out that the determination of committed individuals is also true in every social movement that we can study in history, just as it's true, for example, when we read the book of Acts. Every time individuals emerge to live out their values and their conscience. Palmer says, to live divided no more is to find a new center for one's life, a center external to the demands of others, culture, or institutions. We may face consequences, yet, he says, no punishment anyone lays on you could possibly be worse than the punishment you lay on yourself by conspiring in your own diminishment. In other words, it's worth the price. It's worth the cost to live divided no more. In other words, we need to go beyond blaming others or institutions or even technology, and we need to take charge ourselves. You may know that the word eccentric comes from the Latin meaning having a different center. And I think it's a good word for us to think about and a good word for us to strive towards. Because too much of our lives center around unhelpful priorities. Yet the possibility remains that we can center our lives differently. We can make other priorities prominent. We can choose them. We can choose to live divided no more. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and Eugene Rochberg-Halton, aren't those great names? Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I had to actually look him up in the Wikipedia many years ago and figure out how to pronounce it, and then I spelled it out very carefully and stuck it on my bulletin board and repeated it often, and now I know how to say it. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It's complicated spelling, too. Both of the authors argue that personhood depends on our ability to choose where we focus our energies and passions. That's what personhood depends on. In fact, such decisiveness is key to being a whole and integrated human. Most psychological pathologies, schizophrenia, paranoia, obsessive compulsivity, are in fact disorders of attention. We have the option of deciding to live committed to our highest values, to live divided no more. Parker Palmer notes that the next stage of social movements happens when like-minded people find and rely on one another, build one another up, ask each other important questions. They form what he calls communities of congruence. Communities of congruence that offer mutual support and opportunities to develop a shared vision. Very few of us can hold out very long if we function as solitaries. Ironically, of course, interaction with technology isolates many people and makes these choices more difficult. But it doesn't have to be that way. One year, middle-aged Richard and his two brothers, one older and one younger, decided that they were going to run the Chicago Marathon. Richard lived in Ohio and his two brothers lived in other states. They were far from each other, but here was a project that they could take on together even at a distance. And every week they checked in with each other by employing technology, phone and email primarily, and they reviewed the week's goals and held one another accountable. They offered encouragement and support. They formed a community of congruence together. And when they finally ran the marathon, the successful completion was all the sweeter because they had done it together. When I met him for the first time, Richard was preparing for a second marathon, but this time neither of his brothers could run. And he found that it was much more difficult to prepare for this demanding challenge without his brother's regular encouragement and solidarity. And it was not really clear whether he would make it to the big Chicago event, let alone whether or not he could succeed in the running. We need others for running the race of faith. There is an emerging literature of so-called social contagion that tells us both good behaviors, happiness, good diets, quitting smoking, conviviality, temperate drinking, and poor behaviors, unhappiness, obesity, smoking, loneliness, alcohol abuse, can be passed on through networks, social networks of friends, families, and acquaintances. Staying healthy, say these studies, isn't just a matter of your genes and your diet and your willpower. Good health is also a product, in part, of sheer proximity to other healthy people, communities of congruence. We get caught up by the directions and subconscious signals of those around us. And so the conclusion is clear. Those who want to live differently and deliberately and intentionally need circles of like-minded folks who reinforce the priorities that we long to honor. They help us ask questions about why we live as we do. They encourage us to imagine creative alternatives. Not that we necessarily tell each other what to do, but we learn how to think about such discernment together, and we ask one another careful questions about the choices that face us. As we look to others for help, support, and reinforcement on such crucial matters, there are several strategies that we might consider employing. For example, Borgman has introduced a useful concept that he calls fundamental decisions and daily decisions. A fundamental decision is a commitment that we make that sets a priority for us over a long period to come. I made a fundamental decision some years ago to take a vow as a Benedictine oblate, obliging me to pray some version of the daily office, live out Benedictine values every day in my life and ministry, and to be accountable to the abbot of a particular monastery, St. Gregory's Abbey, for the rest of my life. That was a fundamental decision, a fundamental commitment, as is the fact that I'm a husband and a father, choices that set my priorities for the rest of my days. But it is equally important that we understand the notion of daily decisions. A daily decision is what we decide from day to day to live out according to the priorities of our fundamental decisions, our fundamental commitments. If we don't align our daily decisions with our fundamental commitments, we will not make progress on the fundamental priorities. Borgman's example in one of his books is the fundamental decision to learn the works of Shakespeare. He says, if you want to learn the works of Shakespeare, this means making space in your life to interact regularly with Shakespeare's work, to attend plays, to regularly read his writings, to take a class about him, to memorize excerpts. A fundamental commitment, he points out, cannot be met by haphazard fulfillment. It's not enough from day to day to decide whether or not one will engage Shakespeare if one wants to learn him. Commitments must be in place for a long, long time, and our small daily decisions have to line up with those commitments. And when we are unclear about our long-term fundamental priorities, it's easy to get swept along by the urgency of the moment. Then our daily decisions develop their own momentum or are determined by the decisions or even fundamental commitments of other people. In our culture, I would suggest, with the omnipresent clocks and ringing phones and non-stop emails, can sweep us along with a cascade of small daily decisions that distract us and dislodge us from our professed fundamental priorities. Setting fundamental priorities usually means the exclusion or limiting of options. Our pastor in the last church where we belonged in Indiana used to say, the secret of the spiritual life is the willingness to miss almost everything. What he was trying to say was that when we set certain commitments, it means that we're also willing not to have or do or achieve everything. I try to spend a certain amount of time pretty much every day praying, walking, or other exercise, reading, doing family chores, and this means other options are precluded. I don't have time to do other things that some might consider important. And I think that it's this limitation of options that is so hard for many of us, because we like to keep the illusion of as many options open as possible, open at once. Another concept that Borgman offers, which I find useful, and it's one that I've alluded to a little along the way in the last couple days, is the concept of thresholds. Albert Borgman points out that the thresholds to use technology are low. In the evening, when we are tired and sitting in a comfortable chair in our living room, it does not take much energy to snag a remote control and snap on the television set or a video game or the laptop computer. The thresholds are low. It's easy to go there. It's easier to drive in our communities that are spread out, that have inadequate public transit and don't have sidewalks or shoulders, let alone bike paths. The threshold to drive is low. The threshold against walking or biking or time-consuming public transit is high. When I go to work, it's 8 kilometers from our house. I have a number of options. I can walk a quarter of a mile, wait for the bus, ride the bus for 20 minutes, and then walk for another 20 minutes or so. Or I can take my bike and ride, and it takes about half an hour each way. Or I can walk for an hour and a quarter. Or I can jump into that car in the garage with little thought, with no risk of getting my clothes wrinkled, my hair mussed, or my body sweaty. Walking to work, riding to work, taking transit to work, all have a high threshold. Focal practices such as cooking, hospitality, hiking in the woods, prayer, socializing, spending time with family are often hard to do in our culture. They have a high threshold. They take effort, intentionality, deliberation. They don't occur automatically. Now, in some respects, this threshold is imaginary, really. Because is it really so hard to write a letter, turn off the email, go for a walk, play with children? Yet there's something in us that resists doing so. The irony is that focal practices that have high thresholds also have a high reward. As Borgman says, there is a high threshold and it's difficult to get across it, but once you're across it, the reward is high. After a fine meal, you get up with a glad heart. After playing tennis with your child for a couple of hours, both of you feel good. And the flip side is that activities with a low threshold also have little payoff. It's well established, says Borgman, through research, that when people get up from 2 hours of watching television, and there are similar results with people playing Nintendo games or working on a computer for 2 hours, they don't feel well. They feel worse than they did at the beginning. So low threshold, low rewards. Conveniences, casually consumed, never have the reward of practices that take effort and energy. Stephen Klein has argued that activity intensifies both the anticipation and the enjoyment. And I think this is something that we as Christians want to think about, because we know that church growth advocates sometimes promote seeker-friendly worship that seeks at all costs to lower thresholds and barriers to prospective seekers, including the enticing use of gadgets and devices and technology. Yet rewarding experiences often require concentrated involvement and interaction with complex information. So one strategy, if we think about this concept from Borgman, means that we raise the thresholds against those things that are not our highest priorities. We put technology in the less accessible places. We make it less convenient. So when we moved to Elkhart, Indiana, when we still lived in Waterloo, we did in fact have our TV in a prime place in the living room on the main floor, where I'm embarrassed to admit that the family member who watched TV more than anybody else in the family was me, just so you know. I'm the guy with the problem. And when we moved to Elkhart, Indiana, what we did was we decided to put the television in the basement. So ironically, putting it lower raised the threshold, if you get my drift. So I'd be sitting in the living room in the evening, and I'd think, I've worked so hard at the seminary today. I'm really tired. I deserve to relax. I think I'll go watch TV. And rather than snapping on the remote control, I'd have to stand up from the couch. I'd have to walk across the living room. I'd have to walk through the hall. And if Lorna hadn't caught me by then, when I step on the stairs, it started squeaking. And Lorna would say, "Are you really going to watch television again?" Raising the threshold against watching television. And by the way, I take that as supportive counsel from my wife. Just making sure here that it gets reported accurately. So raising thresholds against the things that really aren't your priorities. One of the things that Lorna and I did when we moved to Toronto was we haven't even connected our TV. We still have one in the basement, but it's never been connected and never been turned on. Another thing that we did was, until then, we had 2 vehicles, and when we moved to Toronto, we got rid of one of the vehicles. This is a way of raising the threshold against using a vehicle. You see, if there are 2 vehicles and I want to do something, I don't have to negotiate with Lorna. But if there is 1 vehicle and I want to use it, it raises the threshold, because it means that Lorna and I need to do the hard work of negotiation together. We have to think about it. It's hard for Lorna because she's married to a Dutchman. It's not so hard for me. I keep arguing, but that's another story. We've raised the threshold against automobility. Now, the point is not to be legalistic or to make lots of rules. Each of us uses the car at times. Rather, the point is that these kinds of decisions help us to pause and ponder rather than make a decision automatically. How necessary is this ride? Are there other ways to accomplish this goal? Are there better ecological options? We are used to thinking that just because we have the device, or just because we can pay for whatever it does, we don't have to think twice about using it. But I long for more carefulness in the kinds of choices that we make. I believe that every time we use a device, we make a theological decision, a theological choice, and we need to make that carefully. More important than restraining technology or raising thresholds against technology is to prioritize what we value by creating conditions that make the priority choices easier and more pleasurable. To look at the barriers and the resistances, and to think about how we can modify them. So, for example, we have a friend named Stan Smith who some years ago resolved to bike to work all year round. He's one of those hardcore guys now. And he realized that one of the things that made it hard to bike to work was the challenge of figuring out the appropriate clothing for each trip. He does live in an area that has 4 different distinct seasons. And so what he did was he created a chart that he put near the back door, detailing how many and what kinds of layers were needed depending on the temperature and the precipitation. He lowered the threshold against taking his bike. He also confirmed the truth, by the way, of Borgman's claim that higher thresholds have greater payoffs. At first, he started biking purely as a personal challenge, and then he noticed that it was a cheaper and healthier way of commuting, and then he realized how much he was enjoying himself, and he would not want to let the bicycling go. Make it easier to do the things that are worthwhile. If walking, jogging, or running is a priority, find places to do so that are lovely or inspirational, that engage you. Go at a time of day when you feel energized and motivated. Make sure that you have good footwear and clothes. In other words, get technology to support, not to supplant your focal practice. The more one engages focal practices, the easier it becomes to choose and keep doing them. They become their own reward, and gradually they perpetuate themselves. Give focal practices a central and a primary place in your life. Do them first. Do them as a priority. Give them the best time of the day. Pray when you are rested. Converse when you feel convivial. Walk when the light is pleasing. Put the focal practices first. Don Postema has a wonderful book called Space for God, and he writes about how hard he found it to squeeze prayer into his calendar. He put prayer on his calendar pages, but somehow that was not compelling enough. And then he says, now I write 7 to 7:30 a.m. God! Somehow that's a little harder to neglect, he tells us. Putting the focal practice in a primary place. Ultimately, Borgman cautions we cannot rein in our technology use with rules about limits or fences. Technology, he says, will be appropriate not when it is enclosed by boundaries, but when it is related to a center. The answer is not to find a line, but to remember and invigorate those centers in our lives that engage our place, our time, and the people around us. My days go better and more deeply reflect who I am and who I want to be if I get up early enough to spend time reading and praying and walking. I am more content, a better friend, a better family person, more fruitful in my labor when I observe a life that has sufficient prayer, reading, exercise, social engagement, and encountering the outdoors. These last couple of days, I've described scenarios that could be seen sometimes as discouraging and dispiriting. I've complained about the geography of non-places and the geography of nowhere. But I don't want you to think that I'm only a curmudgeon. I have not relocated to some remote spot with splendid geography. Lorna and I live in a suburban-looking area, and we have found that there are many consolations and joys there. We enjoy our suppers as a couple. We host guests for meals and in our home. We can walk to church. I can travel on foot to work, and I find places not too far away for hiking, kayaking, canoeing. Our lives are full and busy, yet there is room and time for matters that count, including worship and prayer, reading and writing. And there is beauty, even wildness, in the place where we live. Sparrows, juncos, chickadees, cardinals, blue jays, and cardinals, or I already told you about the cardinals, visit our feeders and our bird feeders. And a sharp-shinned hawk regularly haunts our small backyard as well. He doesn't actually, he thinks bird feeder means something different than I do. On my walk to work, I encounter foxes and deers, even in a busy, crowded metropolis. Earlier, I lamented that I spend far too much time in airports, but I did not tell you the whole story of that day, and the missing details are also important. After my purgatorial airport sojourn, as I tried to sleep in an overpriced airport hotel, I engaged in the ancient Christian discernment consciousness examen. I looked back and pondered where I had met God in that unlikely day. Not just what drew me away from God's reality and presence. I realized that a day full of disappointments and frustrations also had telling moments of revealing grace. And there were many gifts in that day, more than enough to help me through. And the list of the gifts, I think, suggests strategies for spiritual thriving. At the very first airport, as the gate waiting room grew more and more crowded, I ended up sitting close to a uniformed couple. Our tight proximity gave us a choice. We could pretend to ignore each other, or we could get acquainted. The time sped by since we had much to discuss. We even talked about controversial political and military policies together. As a Mennonite who worked in a Mennonite seminary, I didn't often run into people in the military service. And it was inspiring and encouraging for me to get acquainted with folks who at first glance seemed so different from me. But by the time that our flight was called, we were all regretful that our conversation had to end. And at first glance, we had little in common, but we ended with a real connection. And the next day, actually, after we were both been delayed in the O'Hare Airport, we ran into each other again and caught up together before we mounted our final flights. There were other gifts of the day. I found quiet spots all day long, and I was able to spend time in prayer, reading, and getting important work done. Significant and satisfying things were accomplished. One task that day was to read a lengthy manuscript, a student's master's thesis, and to provide feedback for her. I spent a fair bit of time on that project, but when I was given the overly thorough search at one security post, the manuscript with all my notes was misplaced by one of the security people, and I did not realize this until I got to my gate and was ready to board. It was actually fortunate then that that flight too was delayed, because I had enough time to hurry back to the security station and retrieve the work. When I finally got onto the flight, they put me for some reason into first class. I didn't mind so much then when the jet stayed on the runway for a couple hours. I was blissfully unconcerned about which airline would finally pay for this, and I happily accepted the flight attendant's offer of a certain pricey Dutch beverage. That's all I'll say at a Baptist seminary. Once in the air, I read at first, but off to the east an electrical storm put on a dazzling light show. I turned off my reading light and I watched. The beauty moved me, and I was able to relinquish some frustrations of the day. And through it all, I was blissfully freed up from my usual obligations and demands. Turns out that I missed a faculty meeting at our school that was not so crucial after all, and somehow managed just fine without me. As Thomas Erickson reminds us, delays are blessings in disguise. Very seldom is all lost. And what I learned, I think, could apply to so much of my life. God is present, not only in the euphoric, but in the mundane and even in the troubling and the unsettling. One can search for how God speaks even in circumstances that one does not necessarily choose. Presence of mind requires discipline, even in settings that may not at first seem conducive. I was able to work and pray in spite of the obstacles. I was able to meet new people and to offer and receive hospitality. Thich Nhat Hanh tells what he once did when a flight was delayed for 4 hours. I enjoyed, he writes, sitting cross-legged right in the waiting area. I just rolled up my sweater and used it as a cushion, and I sat. People looked at me curiously, but after a while they ignored me, and I sat in peace. There was no place to rest. The airport was full of people, so I just made myself comfortable where I was. We have options. We have choices. In fact, get this, Thich Nhat Hanh likes to go to the airports early. I always, he says, leave for the airport an extra hour early so I can practice meditation there. Friends want to keep me until the last minute, but I resist. I tell them that I need the time. Once I was at O'Hare, and some of you may have been to O'Hare, and there's this tunnel between the two terminals. Maybe you've been through it. The tunnel's long distance is ameliorated by moving sidewalks that transport people, and a loop of space-age sounding music plays on an ongoing and endless cycle, and lights of various colors flicker, reinforcing a science fiction feel. Most people in that tunnel, I find, look subdued as they passively ride the moving belt on the way through. But one time as I went through, I saw a woman dancing on the moving sidewalk, interpreting for all around the soundtrack being played, and it was lovely. And I kid you not, no sooner did I get out of that terminal, at the top of the escalator, there's a Starbucks, and when I looked over, there was a long line outside the Starbucks, a long line of passengers waiting to make a purchase, and there in the line, a man was practicing his tap dancing while standing in the queue. We always have choices. We need not settle for sullenness or boredom, frustration, or hyperactive overextension. Sometimes when I talk about these things, people wonder whether my assumptions are elitist, favoring those who have time or money to afford luxurious focal practices. But most of us have opportunities and options for gardening or cooking, for do-it-yourself home repair or building, for reading or writing, conversation or hospitality, quilting or singing, letter writing or birding. None of these activities needs to require a heavy financial outlay. Most of us, if we would turn off the television or other screens a little more often, can find time for the things that give us the most energy and help us to be fulfilled and enrich others. This is not elitism. We can all make time for visiting, hospitality, sharing, conversation. We can all experience and share abundant life. Many years ago, I read a story of a group of Westerners who were traveling overseas in a country that was well known for inefficiency and red tape. Finally, the journey was over and they were excited. They were ready to go home. But when they arrived at the airport, the Westerners learned that a fierce storm had shut down the airport for 24 hours. They could not even leave the terminal for the next day. The locals, who were used to delays and setbacks, took this in stride. The locals produced wine and sturdier drinks. This was not a Baptist country. Pulled out their cards, proceeded to laugh, carry on, play games, party, and generally have a good time. The Westerners could not settle down. They regularly stormed up to the ticket counters, demanding to know when they could depart. And the answer never changed. Not before mid-afternoon tomorrow at the earliest. In their anxiety, the Westerners did not sleep all night long, hoping that a sudden change would allow them to take off and alter their fate. As predicted, the jets did not go into the air for 24 hours. And after the long delay, the locals were relaxed and refreshed. But the Westerners were wrung out and worn down by their disquiet, and of course, they did not leave any sooner than the locals. Nothing was gained by their anxiety and stress, and much was lost. We have choices, many of them, and there is always God's grace, lots of it. I was once stuck in a small airport, snowed in and uncertain about when we would depart. I was frustrated by the noisy, loud cell phone conversations around me, a little anxious about what the day held and whether or not I would make it to my destination. But in the middle of it all, a dreadlocked individual nearby pulled out his guitar and practiced jazz for an hour, and it was lovely. Another time, I was in an airport all night long, waiting for a dense fog to lift, and as time went on, people there grew friendlier and friendlier with each other. We conversed, we laughed at our travails, we watched out for each other's possessions, and gradually we all nodded off, sleeping on uncomfortable airport seats, but feeling safe in the company of our new friends. It was an adventure, and we were not alone. All things considered, there are other places I'd rather be than airports, and numerous other ways that I wished we lived in this culture. But even in the face of such burdens and barriers, I need not be shaped, determined, or formed, or hindered, or hampered by them. When I pay attention and act with deliberation, when I stay alert and make careful choices, when I honor awe and reverence, then my life is meaningful and fulfilling. At such times, I find myself engaged and satisfied. Not all is lost, not by a long shot. It is still possible to live the good life. God's grace is abundant. This I want to remember well. Thank you.
As is our practice on our last evening, we curtail the question period a bit, but we will entertain a few questions. So I will remind you to speak directly into the mic so that they can be recorded, and would invite you to, those of you who might like to have some interaction with Dr. Boers. Anyone have a question?
You mentioned that you spoke of the difference between the fundamental plans and the daily plans,
right,
and how the daily plans need to work in harmony with that. In the work of many within this room, dare say all, in whatever vocation we find ourselves called to be immersed, no pun intended, we find that we are working with people in churches and other ministry areas where their fundamental plans perhaps are different from our own, and yet we are called upon to be servants. And in that servanthood ministry, could you comment for a moment on the tensions, creative though they may be, within trying to implement a fundamental life plan that you may have for yourself, and then trying to achieve a successful servant ministry to others who are drawing you away from those high ideals that may have set you on that course in the first place?
Tim, I think I get your question, but do you want to just quickly rephrase it another way?
Okay, sure. So I start ministry with a certain focus as to what I think God is calling me to do.
Okay.
I meet many people in a congregation, and they have many different opinions, and I feel myself pulling left, right, forward, backward.
Right.
How can I, as a leader within that, find a harmony?
Right.
In doing, as was suggested, a fundamental plan with daily options that support that.
Okay, good. Thanks. I think that's a really good question, and it's a very important question for people who are in ministry, because as we know, people in ministry are subject to the demands of many different agenda from different directions. And I think there are temptations for people who are in ministry who are eager to please people and make them feel happy. And I don't know how the Baptist system works, but when I was a Mennonite pastor, we had an election every 3 years about the pastor, and the pastor was expected to have a high rate of positive affirmation. So it's actually a harder job than running for office, because you couldn't get by with just a 51% vote. Actually, in Canada, of course, in Canadian Parliament, you can have a majority government and just have 6% of the vote, right? So it's tough being a pastor, and there are temptations. One of my friends talks about too many ministers who want to be a quivering mass of availability. That's one way of describing the temptation. And I think another temptation is some people have said that pastors are sometimes like stray dogs at Whistler's conventions, being tugged in many different directions at once. It's absolutely important for people who exercise leadership or ministry of whatever kind to understand what their crucial priorities are, and to keep them in place and keep harking back to them. And often I think it's helpful to have good colleagues who help remind us about those commitments, because otherwise, in fact, we can get tugged in too many directions. I also think that one of the things that we need to remember is that one of the gifts that we can offer other people is to lead a life that is balanced and centered and grounded. And I often have, it's very un-Mennonite of me to say this, but I often have students who come to me and say, it seems like you live with a sense of purpose or direction. It seems like you have figured some of these things about daily disciplines. Can you help me in my life? And I think that if we just go about living the same kind of scattered, dissipated life, we don't do anybody else a favor. And so I think the challenge is for us to learn how to live abundant life in a way that's inviting for other folks. It does sometimes mean paying a price. But as Parker Palmer says, that price is that price is not as costly as the price of living divided. The price of living divided no more is better than subjecting ourselves to other kinds of demands.
Dr. Boers would like to take this opportunity to say a few things, and then I will invite Dr. Gardner to come up and close us more formally.
Well, and just in saying goodbye, I want to repeat again how grateful that I am for my time with you. Lorna and I have felt warmly welcomed and appreciate the hospitality that's been offered to us. The support that has been given here is extraordinary, and we are very impressed with the Acadia community. We have really enjoyed our time getting to know students and staff and faculty. We've been encouraged by the challenging conversations, and I'm grateful and honored that you have so seriously engaged my ideas and pushed back with me and challenged me about that. And this, to me, for me, and for Lorna, has been a great visit, and I want to thank you. And I want to say quite honestly that these days while I was here, I could say truly, there is nothing I'd rather do, no one I'd rather be with, no place I'd rather be. This I shall remember well. Thank you very much.